Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Center for the Arts and Humanities event, a conversation focused on banning books and learning, understanding what's happening and what we can do about it. As directors for the Center for Arts and Humanities, Michelle Burnham and I, Amy Randall, appreciate your willingness to spend some time and energy this afternoon thinking about some important challenges facing our society today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Santa Clara University occupies the unceded land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone peoples. I'd like us to take a moment of silence to register this acknowledgement and this debt, and as we do so, to also recognize that land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and it's necessary for us to become more mindful of our present participation. Today's conversation will be moderated by our very own Dr. Margaret Hunter, Professor of Sociology and Strategic Advisor to the Dean for Faculty Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives at Santa Clara University. Maggie has published widely on colorism, especially in Black and Latinx communities. She also researches race and equity in higher education. Her recent article, Educational Ecosystems for Equity, was published in the Resource Handbook for Academic Deans, the essential guide for college and university leaders. She is currently researching students' sense of belonging at historically Black colleges and universities. I now hand the floor to Maggie Hunter, who will introduce our distinguished guests today, Drs. Leslie Alexander and Rod Ferguson. Thank you, Maggie.
Thanks, Amy. I'm so glad to be here with you all. This is a very pressing topic, and we have two very impactful speakers joining us today. I'd like to start off introducing Dr. Leslie Alexander. She is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Professor of History at Rutgers University. She's a scholar of Black culture, identity, and political activism. She's the author of books including African or American, Black Identity and Political Activism in New York City, 1784 to 1861, and Fear of a Black Republic, Haiti and the Birth of Black Internationalism. She's working on a new book project called How We Got Here, Slavery and the Making of the Modern Police State. She's won awards for diversity and equity work and even for excellence in teaching. We're so pleased to have you here, Leslie. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'd now like to introduce Dr. Roderick Ferguson. He is the William Robertson Co-Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Professor of American Studies at Yale University. He's the author of several books, including We Demand, The University and Student Protests, The Reorder of Things, The University and Its Pedagogies of Minority Difference, and Aberrations in Black Toward a Queer of Color Critique, among other books. Dr. Ferguson's scholarly work crosses many disciplinary boundaries as he investigates social movements, critical university studies, the intersections of race and sexuality, and social theory. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a very sobering topic to discuss today, but we're looking forward to hearing the insights given the work that you all both spend a lot of time on. So I want to just start off with sort of context for the audience. You know, in the last several years, we've seen a big uptick in laws and regulations banning or limiting the teaching about racism and sexism, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. Some of these are book bans, some of them are curricular bans, limits on what professors can say, all of those kinds of things. Can you start us off? And Leslie, I'll start with you. Can you start us off? Why now? What do you think is happening in this moment that's gotten us here?
Yeah, I think that is a really important question because, you know, as I think at least we know, and I imagine most of the viewers know, it's not like there hasn't been a very long history, right? And a long battle over what education was going to look like in this country, who gets access to it, who doesn't get access to it, the relationship between economics, right, and wealth, and the quality of education. So there's a long history here, and there's a long battle over what the educational system in this country is going to look like. I do think, though, that we are experiencing a particular kind of historical moment, a particular watershed type of experience that I think has a lot to say about the broader political climate that is unfolding in the United States right now. And I think it is important to acknowledge that there have been important publications and important interventions into both the scholarly community, but I think also kind of the social and political, the public community, that have radically changed and altered the nature of this conversation. I think to a large degree, the country, I would say probably in the past, at least the past 5 years, longer than that, right? Probably stemming back to the original election of Donald Trump. I think we have entered into a political environment in this country where everything has become politicized and everything has become a battleground over political ideology. And as I said, I think we should be honest about the fact that publications like the 1619 Project, I contributed to the book version, some of these publications and interventions have created a situation in which public awareness has come to certain topics regarding the long history of this country. And of course, those of us who exist within academia have been trying to push and raise consciousness around these topics for decades, right? But some of these topics have actually bridged the gap, right? Have gone beyond the ivory tower, have become much more accessible to the public community, and obviously have become intensely politicized. I think sometimes in cases that are reasonable and relevant, I think in most cases have become politicized for totally unnecessary and counterproductive reasons. But I think it has essentially then created this battle between how are we going to tell the history of this country? How are we going to describe the current contemporary state of this country? How are we going to teach these topics to young people? And it has all of a sudden then led to, right, this proliferation of what we've been seeing, the banning of books, as well as the banning of even the teaching of certain topics in the public school systems. And obviously in some states like Florida and Ohio, it's also starting to move into higher education as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rod, do you want to address this issue of why now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to add on to what, Leslie was saying, we're at a moment where there are two types of advances, taking place. One is the advancement of, a right-wing politics, especially as we've seen it, in terms of, elections and also in terms of policies, right? So we've got that. We could probably even go further back than Trump and go to the Tea Party, for instance, era in terms of that kind of mobilization that is very much anxious about whether white people are being replaced, that, sort of formations and critiques, from feminism, from queer studies, from ethnic studies are advancing to the detriment of at least the aims of, conservative forces. And at the same time, we've got the advancement of, precisely what Leslie was talking about, of progressive, literatures and also social movements, right? So both of those things are happening at once. And in many ways, the advancement of the right wing and the conservative formations is a reaction to, the inroads that have been made by the progressive forces. One of the things that I've said in other settings like this is that, when do you ban literature and ban speech? And when do you use the law to do that? You use the law to do that when you realize that you have lost the ideological advantage. Okay? So you mobilize repressive forces because you feel as if the ideological maneuvers, techniques, are out of your hands, right? And I think that's what we're witnessing at this moment. On the flip side, we could look at this moment as also an encouraging one that, works like the 1619 Project, the critiques of, class inequalities, of gender inequalities, of racial inequalities, of the visibility and assertiveness of trans communities, those have been successes, and we should take some moments to observe the fact that they have succeeded, okay? To the extent that it would require such a vicious, in many ways, violent response to those successes.
Mm-hmm. Can I kind of chime on that really quickly? Because I think this is a really, really important point, that what we are witnessing in part is a reactionary backlash against progress. Mm-hmm. And I think that, so I'm really glad that you raised it and, phrased it so clearly, Rod, because I think that we also have to acknowledge that there's been progress made in lots of areas, right? That it's been in the political arena relative to the mobilization of social consciousness, right? And we saw a global outpouring of support for a movement like the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. But it's also that if you want to look at the nature of education in this country, I'm going to take a broad leap here and imagine that the three of us are probably part of the same generation-ish, right? Mm-hmm. And what that means is that, let's put it this way, when I was in college, I had very few professors that looked like us and that studied the topics that we study. Mm-hmm. We now, exist at every university. We're no longer in a situation where the only one in our department that studies race or gender or sexuality or class or, it used to be that we were few and far between, and that we were kind of isolated, right? And trying to sort of fight the good fight on our own. We're obviously still having to fight the good fight, but we're doing it with a much larger team and with a lot more folks. And we're publishing, we're getting work out there, we're getting the word out, right? And so we are very literally transforming the face of education, and particularly of higher education. And that means that we are producing generations of young people who are then coming out of universities and are entering the rest of the world, right, with a radically different perspective than what they entered with. And so I think my point is that we're seeing the evidence of how true, honest, holistic, inclusive education can actually transform and radicalize a population of people. And for those who do not want thoughtful, critical thinking, engaged, awake citizens, mm-hmm. education then becomes this very threatening presence.
Mm-hmm. Right.
feel like I need to spend more time with the two of you. You're shifting my thinking already to feel like, oh, maybe we're winning and we're not losing. And that these
we're fighting,
that these are responses to some victories. So I appreciate that reframe of this, really. And I don't disagree with you. The reactions to these victories that we've had are strong, and they're across a number of different dimensions. So I'm wondering if you can comment, and Rod, I'll start with you this time. Do you see, or I should ask, what kinds of connections do you see between these bans on learning and knowledge and ideas and things like bans on access to abortions or gender affirming care for young people and things like that?
No, I mean, they're absolutely of a piece, that the literatures, the culture production, the intellectual production that Leslie and I have been invoking have been about these things, right? They've been about sort of reproductive justice. They've been about, environmental justice, right? They've been about, justice for workers, so all of these things, are connected. So it's really important for us to see the kind of cartography, that's being illuminated here, that you ban books about race, about queerness, about transness, at the very same moment that you're trying to go after those communities, So there's a way in which the moment also illustrates the real social and communal effects of literacy, in this moment. And, I started reading, to understand this moment, I started reading this book called When I Can Read My Title Clear. And the subtitle, do you know this book, Leslie?
Yes.
Yeah, the subtitle is, I have it right here, Literacy, Slavery, and Religion in the Antebellum South. And it's a history of, one, the birth of Black reading publics during the antebellum period, but also the backlash against those reading publics, precisely because of the fear that the reading that Black people free and enslaved were doing would lead to social changes. So you had the sort of legal and de facto prohibition against Black reading because of the way that Black people were reading. That an engagement with the text could lead to a dissatisfaction with the society and also lead to an imaginative reordering of the society and the demand for that reordering, And so there's a way in which, that genealogy is invoked in this moment as well, right? That it is about literacy being used as the basis of personal and also social transformations, right? I thought about this recently, that a lot of the anti-woke legislation is justified, through the rhetoric of, we do not want white people to feel badly, okay? Now, at that moment, it's not just about protecting, quote unquote, white fragility. It is also about trying to prevent the possible moment where white people start to distance themselves from whiteness. That, if we had a world in which, those fathers, white fathers in Portland who used their leaf blowers, to blow away the tear gas, right? Or the white folks who were in Virginia, on that day, right? where the neo-Nazis attacked the crowd, right? That if you had more people like the woman who put her life on the line, right? White people who would then distance themselves from the project of white supremacy. You know, the right wing has a crisis at that moment. You know, the constituency that it counted on, it may no longer have. I mean, that's part of the threat of the critical literacies of this time, that they not only reach people of color, but they also might reach the constituency that you thought you had in the bank.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What I hear you saying, I think, is that some of this legislation is designed, of course, to suppress people of color, queer people, other folks, but also to control the behavior of white people who may want to become race traitors, for example, to use some of the language of whiteness literature, so that there's directed toward them as well.
That, you know, this is also a moment in which these laws reveal that they don't want any kind of sort of critical transformation, you know, happening in the classroom.
That's right.
But it is also a moment that reveals that they don't want that critical transformation to reach white people either.
Because then we'll really be in trouble.
Then we'll really be in trouble. What if you had, you know, like young white people like those young whites in Mississippi Freedom Summer who decided they're going to go to Mississippi with their Black comrades, you know, and work on behalf of racial justice, you know?
Yeah. Leslie, do you want to comment on how these things are connected to some of these other political pieces of legislation that are happening now in court decisions?
Yeah, I think I would just underscore exactly what Rod just said, which is that ultimately this is really about power and about control. And, you know, I was speaking in another venue about all of this anti-woke legislation recently, and I kind of want to reiterate here the point that I made there, which is that I think even the language of anti-woke tells us really everything we need to know about the opposition to education, to holistic education in this country. Because what I hear when I hear anti-woke is that you are fundamentally opposed to the basic concept of people being awake. What you want is an asleep, unconscious,
docile,
uninformed, docile, passive, uneducated, unengaged population of people. And what they are afraid of in wokeness, what they are afraid of is people being awake. And awake means informed, educated, engaged, and critically examining what is happening in society around them. You know, those of us who are in the humanities and social sciences, we teach, and I'm not trying to say the physical sciences don't, but I'm just saying that's my lane. You know, the people who live in my lane are people who are about teaching critical thinking, right? Whenever we're creating our rubrics and, you know, our teaching goals and all of that, they all come down to this concept of critical thinking. What do we mean by that? What we mean is people who take in information and use their own enlightened, awakened intellect to engage with what is being presented to them, raising questions about it for the purpose of gaining better understanding. That's terrifying to a population of people who want you to be asleep, who want you to be unwoke, right? Because what critical thinking does is create, again, a population, a generation of people who are raising questions, who are not simply standing by and passively accepting what is being fed to them. And as Rod indicated, are questioning things like racism, right? Questioning things like homophobia, who are, you know, challenging transphobia, who are actually saying perhaps as human beings, we actually have far more in common than we do that divides us. And for someone who wants to use divide and conquer as a strategy for control, that is the most terrifying thing that there is, right? Is to have a situation in which people are actually saying, I now have learned something about you, even though you are very different from me. And I now have a greater understanding and appreciation of you as a fellow human being. And that brings us closer, right? And again, helps us see that we have far more in common than we do different. And again, for someone who wants to use divide and conquer as a tool to divide and oppress people, right? Enlightened, engaged, awake education, and, enlightened thinkers is about the most terrifying presence that there can be.
If I could add to that, this is why, the 18th and 19th century histories in this country are really instructive because people were very explicit. Those who were opposed to, what Leslie's talking about in terms of an enlightened and critical population, they were very explicit about not wanting it. The distinction that the folks in our moment have is that they have come closer than many right-wing formations to being that explicit, in saying that, no, we don't want people who are alert. We don't want people who develop consciousness. We want you asleep. We want you docile. Like before these formations, those agendas were there, but no one would have dared, on the conservative side to be as explicit as they are now, So they're striking and instructive parallels between this moment and the antebellum one.
Mm-hmm. So, as you're saying that, it's making me think about, the discourse that we use and that the right uses in particular, the radical right here. And, I'm thinking about freedom of speech. And I'm wondering if you all can comment on the ways that I'm not going to say the ways that some folks are using it now that seem confusing. So what I mean by that is, you're saying, Rod, in the past, the recent past would have been very difficult to say, we don't want these ideas being discussed, period. And now we're comfortable saying it and we're calling it freedom of speech. And I wonder if you can comment on this conundrum, especially for universities where this freedom of speech issue is really quite strong. And a lot of universities and professors are kind of coming under attack for not, quote unquote, allowing freedom of speech by speaking certain things. So can you help us try to understand this topsy-turvy way?
Maybe Leslie, you want to go first since I went first the last time?
Go for it, Leslie.
I mean, yeah, I'm reacting this way because I find these conversations and this strategy so frustrating, right? Because it is precisely the same people who are trying to ban books and are trying to ban topics from being taught in school, even on the college level, who at the same time want to invoke the right to free speech. And there is a fundamental contradiction and conundrum in there that for whatever reason, those of us who are not on the far right are not doing a very good job, I don't think, of raising that contradiction, around at the same time, clinging to freedom of speech in the one hand, at the same time, banning books and banning certain topics to be discussed. I'm not sure I'm not sure what we need to do differently or better to sort of raise that contradiction. But I think it's important that we do it. On university campuses, of course, what we see is members of the far right using the right to free speech to justify bringing all kinds of hate mongers, I think, is probably the easiest and clearest way to say it, right? People who, spew nasty, discriminatory propaganda against, immigrants, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community, right? I mean, every imaginable group of people. And then they want to try to stand behind the right to free speech. It's like you said, to me, it's a completely topsy-turvy, type of system where what it really boils down to, in my mind, is that the way that they kind of use freedom of speech as a weapon is to argue that the people who they want to hear from have a right to free speech. Yeah. But, basic fundamental historical truths cannot be spoken of, right? So it's fascinating to see, the way they brandish, the pen banning things in one hand, right? And then try to stand behind, the freedom of speech shield at the same time. I feel like you can't actually have it both ways. You either feel like all ideas have a right to be expressed or you don't. And it's clear that they only want certain ideas to be expressed.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add that, I tried to get at this in my book, We Demand, especially the chapter on the Powell Memorandum. This was the secret memo that the eventual Supreme Court Justice in the Bakke case, right, the affirmative action case, Lewis Powell, wrote to the private business owners that make up the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. One of the things that he said that touches on this issue is that, he tried to construct those who were in favor of the free market as minorities, okay? And that their viewpoints were being suppressed by all of the sort of socialists, on university campuses, both students and the faculty. It was a genius sleight of hand, okay? In the sense that it constructed the wealthy as minorities, the ones who have access to the radio stations, the TV stations, the college boards, and what have you, as people whose speech was being stifled by progressives, okay? And by women and by people of color, okay? So it has a long history to it. It raised emotional blackmail to the level of politics, right? If I can get you to think that the wealthy, the powerful are minorities, then maybe you would identify with those folks and at least forward and help promote some of their agendas, And so, like Leslie's saying, the contradictions to it are glaring in this moment, all right? Now, these are the same folks who have argued that corporations are articulating speech when they deny services, to customers, all right? And at the same time, the DeSantis administration is going after Disney for articulating speech around queer folks. And added to that, the sort of wholesale banning of the speech that should take place in the classroom as part of what a classroom does in terms of the assignment of literature. So the contradictions, the hypocrisies are absolutely glaring, and they expose the free speech maneuver as really a power strategy. It's not about fairness. It's not about ethics. It is about how can we gain advantage, again, against these folks who seemingly have the ideological advantage.
I really appreciate that parallel to the Bakke decision. That's really interesting. I want to shift us slightly, and I'm thinking about the political responses to these actions by various policymakers. Leslie, you were talking about divide and conquer and the dangers of that. And I'm wondering if, Rod, I think this question is for you maybe, but maybe both. If you could comment on the coalitional politics of the moment. How are we doing in terms of our abilities for these different groups and different movements to sort of back each other up, to work together for defeating various kinds of legislation? How are we doing on the defying that divide and conquer strategy?
You want me to go first?
Yeah,
Maggie?
why don't you?
Okay, yeah, sure. This is one of the areas in which I feel really I'm encouraged, because if you take like the two Justins in Tennessee, right? And just listen to the various speeches that they made before and after, right? Those are coalitional speeches that they're making, right? Linking, the struggle against racism to the struggle against transphobia, to the struggles against labor exploitation, to the struggles on behalf of reproductive freedoms and autonomy. So it's a moment in which the coalitional discourse is alive and booming. The way in which people are trying to, who are not necessarily Native, trying to link their immediate issues to issues around settler colonialism and sovereignty, water rights, land rights. I think it's a terrifically interesting moment for coalitions, and it will only become more so, right? I was just reading an article yesterday about the sort of responses that people in Nashville, collective responses that they've had to the recent shootings, mass killing there, right? And people who you would not necessarily assume would be linking arms are now linking arms, right? Because a bullet is an equal opportunity killer, right? And out of that, and because of that, I think we'll see even more unlikely coalitions and strange affinities happening.
Yeah, I again completely agree. I feel really encouraged by the coalition politics that I see, not only being articulated, because it's one thing to pay lip service to something and then it's another something else to when it's actually in practice, but I'm inspired by both. I'm inspired by the way in which the politics of coalition is being articulated and also how it's being carried out. Is it perfect? No. Do we still have more work to do? Yes. But I think that more than and I'm saying this as a historian, but I feel like more than at any other point in history than I can think of in this country, I actually see a real commitment to building solidarity, to communities supporting each other and backing up, to thinking and planning in very conscious and intentional ways. How do we do better at building coalitions? How do we do better at learning more about each other? How do we do better at backing each other up and supporting each other? I see that happening in very conscious and intentional ways. Again, it's not always perfect, but the fact that we're actually thinking about it and working on it very intentionally, I think says a great deal about the potential of what's happening in this moment right now. And I have to say that, again, not to say that any of the movements that are taking place or have taken place are perfect. They're all flawed, in ways that all humans are flawed, right? But one of the real contributions and breakthroughs that I think the Black Lives Matter movement has made is about changing the understanding of who is allowed to stand at the forefront of a movement, who is allowed to be the face of a movement, who is allowed to be a spokesperson, right, for a movement, and who a movement ought to care about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, one of the traps, again, this is, my interpretation as a historian, but I think that one of the traps that Black social movements in particular have fallen victim to over the years, for completely understandable historical reasons, is the trap of respectability politics, right? Whatever we say and do has to be palatable, right, to white folks, and it has to be palatable to whoever we feel like is in power that we have to convince. And I think one of the really transformative things that a lot of folks in the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think it has proliferated into other movements and other organizations, is to say, we're not making this palatable to you anymore, right? Like we're going to embrace the people in our community that you have cast aside, that you have said we should not care about, that you have said that we should reject.
That's right.
Because of who they are or what they do or who they love or how much money they make or whether they've been in jail or, you know what I mean? All of these things, right?
Yeah.
That it's all of us. It's going to take all of us and we're going to embrace all of us.
Yeah.
And again, that doesn't mean that always operates perfectly, right? We haven't reached operational perfection, but the idea that is the goal and that is the vision and the intention is fundamental, in my opinion, is fundamentally transformative.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I couldn't agree more that, you think about like Kathy Cohen's wonderful book in the late 90s, The Boundaries of Blackness, which was exactly about this point, right? The respectability politics that governed normative African-American politics to the exclusion of queer folks, of people with HIV/AIDS, drug users, sex workers within the community, right?
Yes.
And then you had something like Black Lives Matter. That was the first time I was ever in, I think, anti-racist Black marches where there were chants for queer and trans people, for queer and trans people.
Yes.
That's right. It was the first, so the Black Lives Matter movement produced an epistemic shift in terms of the boundaries of Blackness.
Yes.
And, it is a shift that the other movements have also received, it seems.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think about the influence of feminist politics on movements writ large and really that kind of intersectional approach. And, as you were talking about, Leslie, kind of juxtaposing this with the prior sort of Black mainstream politics, in some ways, I think what will be interesting to see is right now, most of our national elected Black politicians are still more circumscribed, I think, in a kind of more traditional Black politics. And so I feel like what you all are describing is rooted in more of an activist movement still. And I think the question will be, can they shift into other kinds of positions of power without losing that more radical imagination that is what animates these movements so much? I think, we will have to wait and see, but I think those tensions are still with us.
I definitely agree. Although, I mean, again, I see hope in the young people that Rod was talking about, the Justins, but also the squad.
Yeah.
So I see some hope in movement, in that regard. But I also think that what is different, and again, I'm a 19th century historian, so I naturally go back to the antebellum period, or let's say in this case the post-Civil War period. But I think one of the things that is significant is that even though, as you said, some of our elected leaders still feel kind of trapped by the system, we're no longer in a situation where they are the only spokespersons.
Right.
Right. I mean, social media has something to do with that, right? But there also is, again, a situation in which the movement has evolved in a direction, and the leadership, quote unquote, right, now has to catch up, right, with where the movement is. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we are in a different situation where, the kind of mainstream respectability politics folks are no longer the only people who can and do speak for the race, right? Or speak for whoever the constituent community is. And again, I think that then changes the game.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking the last few minutes about the powerful responses and really grassroots, widespread, galvanized movements, some of which are global, which have been really empowering and a breath of fresh air and providing us all a lot of hope. What if, just to play devil's advocate, what if this onslaught of laws, the restricting our rights, reducing our ability to know things, what if that really gains some real traction? What if it holds up in the courts to some extent? What's our dystopian near-term future look like? What are we in store for here if we continue to see these kinds of bans on knowledge and books and curriculum?
Well, I mean, you'll have, this is on the negative side, right?
Yeah.
That, you will have, a kind of, if you imagine the US in one of those maps, right? There will be patchwork literacies, across that map. Okay. It would mean, for instance, that if since we're in sort of university setting right now, if you are someone who just completed a dissertation, in queer studies, feminist studies, critical ethnic studies, Black studies, what have you, every state on that map is not necessarily available to you in terms of your market. Okay. It means that in terms of public school education, that some people will know what, the letter from the Birmingham jail is. And some people won't. It will mean that some kids, have a literacy around, sort of queer and transgender freedoms that will match the clubs that they have in their schools. And it will mean that other kids don't have that even on the bookshelves. In fact, it might be against the law to have. Here's the positive, though, okay? For those folks that live under a ban, okay, what you will also see are subcultures of literacy forming, okay? This is where it would have benefited the folks on the right to actually do some historical reading. Censorship does not work, right? What does it do? It produces a desire for the very thing that you have censored, okay? So you will then also see these sort of literate subcultures taking place in homes, in neighborhoods, in libraries to the extent that they have them, or just on the street, okay? It will be uneven, but it will also produce the interesting unevenness that we associate with autodidacticism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ditto. Completely agree. I mean, I'm a scholar of resistance movements. And so I naturally go to the place of thinking, how will people respond? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Rod said is really important, right? That I don't actually think over the long term it's going to work.
Right.
And I think it's not going to work because people are going to want to have access to the thing they're told they're not supposed to have. Mm-hmm. And I also think it's because there are going to be communities of people locally, but also across the country who are going to be plotting, planning, organizing, envisioning what it looks like to deliver that information in alternative ways. I think we're going to see Saturday and Sunday schools pop up. Churches will turn Sunday schools into alternative learning opportunities. I mean, people will find ways to resistance movements will always find a way.
That's right.
And, so I believe that I'm already working, with other faculty members to think about how do we find ways to provide the information that we present in our classrooms free of charge to parents in places like Florida. And if it comes to it, Ohio and other places around the country. I think that parents are going to be determined to make sure that their kids become educated. I think those of us who believe in, the quality and the importance of what we have to share, we're going to find ways to make sure that it gets into the hands of the people who want it. Yeah. So I don't think the movement will die. It will just simply find new life in new ways.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? It will be a moment of mass creativity. And that's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. It really is. I was thinking, is this our next generation of freedom summer? Or are we going to, in freedom schools, where these sort of little, mom and pop shop schools get set up and radical education?
I hope so.
I remember when those things were common. I went to one of those Saturday schools because the Black parents in my town were dissatisfied with the public schools, Mm-hmm. I remember, getting books I grew up in rural Georgia, but I used to order books from the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Atlanta and just pass them out. When I finished, pass them out to friends of mine, we were like kids in rural Georgia who were reading the negritude poets because, interesting things are going to happen.
Yeah. So let me ask you both a question from the audience, which is really related to what you're saying. The person said that I'm most worried about vulnerable folks in states where these bans and hostilities are strongest and feel most violent, and who don't have the privilege or ability to leave those states right now. And the person says, are you aware of, or can you imagine any cross-state coalitions that could both provide support and resistance for these kinds of issues? Mm-hmm. I feel like we spend a lot of time blue states, red states separate. Do you imagine or foresee or know about?
No, Leslie pointed, Leslie said as much, right? That there will be cross-state coalitions, happening because of this, right? That's one, but also two, let's also not assume, I'm from Georgia. Let's not also assume that people want to leave just because it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Some people want to stay and fight.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is the message that, when I did a panel with the African American Policy Forum and Paul Ortiz, from the university, from one of the universities in Florida, and one of the faculty labor leaders there said, like, we are fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
We're not leaving.
That's right.
So let's not tell ourselves that the way in which people are going to respond is an out-migration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mobilization means that you figure out how to engage the troubles around you.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think that type of organizing is already happening.
Mm-hmm.
Faculty members across the country are already forming. I get emails constantly from, here's another group organizing to do this. Would you be interested in participating? So I think faculty, on the university level, I think faculty are already organizing, plotting, planning, thinking about this in multiple ways, right? Mm-hmm. How do we fight the bans? How do we support our colleagues who are in states where the bans are going into effect? But also, like I said, on the larger scale, thinking about how do we find ways to get knowledge, education, information in my mind, it should be into the hands of parents and guardians, right? Mm-hmm. Because politicians might be able to ban what's taught in the classroom, right? In a public school. They can't control what we talk about in our houses, and in spaces that we have control over. Mm-hmm. So I think it's also about how do we, I think people are already thinking in that direction and trying to envision what that might look like. And I think, as Rod said, it's important to keep in mind that some people may leave, but it's also about how do we support struggles that are happening on the local level, right? Because those struggles are happening. And the question is, how do we galvanize our forces to lend our support to the places where more folks are needed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think I'm sorry, go ahead, Leslie.
No, I was just going to point really quickly. Yeah, the walkouts I think are important. I was going to point quickly to, a couple of academic organizations. The National Council for Black Studies just held their conference at the University of Florida and had a whole series of conversations and discussions around the fight that's happening in Florida. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History is holding its conference in the fall, also in Florida, in Jacksonville, and they're already planning large community convenings. That there's a whole series of sessions that are focused on this. So, I think individuals, but I also think organizations and institutions are trying to think about how do we organize in ways to help support the struggles where they're needed the most. But sorry, Rod, go ahead about that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that, for instance, the sort of mass walkouts that high school students are doing,
Yep.
in the South, right, should be encouragement to those of us outside of the South to learn from those folks and produce walkouts here in the North or on the West Coast,
Mm-hmm.
And so I talked about, for instance, the kind of creative work that will be taking place. Much of that creative work is going to be taking place in those places that have bans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm thinking about the role of the university. I feel like in this most recent iteration of bans of various sorts, the university and university people are sort of cast as victims of rogue politicians, state level especially. But the university's not always been on the right side of these issues, particularly around freedom of speech and equity and racial justice and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering if you all can help us unpack a little bit, how can we think about the role of the university now? What ought we be doing, but is the university the right source of revolutionary activity, or do we just happen to be on the right side of it this time?
Well, I think, Rod, I don't want to cut you off if you have something you want to say, but, I think that it's 100% true, right? That universities, historically speaking, and even often contemporarily, have been, let's just say, hostile. Let's just put it out there, right? To a lot of the different topics that these same bands are seeking to attack, right? Like Black Studies, of course, was the first like real entree, right, into higher education. And I assume that most of us know, right, the painful history of what it required to establish Black Studies in higher education. And of course, all of these other areas, women's studies, queer studies, all of the other ethnic studies, right? All of these faced similar fights and opposition, and in many places around the country still are, right? More than 50 years later, right? We're still having to battle this out. But I think that despite the fact that the university system writ large was not, I'm just going to say, in my opinion, was not designed for us, did not imagine us as participating in this way, and have historically been hostile to our presence. I don't think that necessarily means that we can't, harness the university structure to support what we're advocating for. Because at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is academic freedom. Mm-hmm. And that's what the university is predicated on, right? Academic freedom and academic responsibility. Those are the twin pillars, right? And so I think that it behooves us to remind our colleagues, right? And remind the institutions in which we exist that the whole system of higher education is predicated on academic freedom. And that as soon as you start banning books, banning topics, banning departments, banning courses, right? As soon as you start tinkering, right, with the system in that way, then the entire system that the university is predicated on explodes. And so I think we do have to remind in the same way, again, going back to the 19th century, right? In the same way that Black activists in the 18th and 19th century had to challenge the United States to say, remember your founding documents? Remember what you said in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence about we're all born with, certain natural rights, and liberty is one of them, and equality and justice, right, are in there too. And the same way that they had to keep reminding, right, the nation to stay true to what it claimed to be about, I think we're going to have a responsibility, right, to remind higher education and remind the institutions in which we exist the core principles that they have always said that they are about, and that this is a moment where that is being put to the test, and they have to defend, right, their founding principles.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, to add to that it will always be the students and the teachers at universities who will try and preserve those core principles, right? Administrations are fundamentally conservative, right? Let me just say that, okay? They're fundamentally conservative. And so they run up against a contradiction when you have a body like the classroom that is, at least in its ideal, supposed to produce epistemic shifts, okay? We don't need to look to, and we don't have to look to administration, as the site that will lead the fight. It won't, the sort of labor struggles, that have taken place at Rutgers and the UC system, the New School, are illustrations of that, right? Mm-hmm. The charge of, preserving the ideal of the life of the mind is the charge that is in the hands of students and teachers, period. Okay. The classroom at this moment remains a powerful site, for producing, critical literacies and idioms. I think that maybe we're at a moment where we see that the work in the classroom cannot simply stay in the classroom or on the university campus, all right? I think that's key, right? And we should take encouragement from, the Black Lives Matter movement, No Doppel, the sort of abortion rights movement. I mean, listen to the rhetoric. People have been reading, the categories that they are using, in their speeches, in their chants, are categories that they derived from, the work that many of us have been doing, in the academy. The point there is that it can't stay in the academy,
That's right.
And we need to tell ourselves that the academy is going to be the vanguard of, a social transformation. It won't. But it can be the site that gives people the tools for social transformation.
Yeah.
100%. 100%. And I just, if you don't mind, Maggie, just really quickly, I wanted to, when Rod was talking about the classroom and, what an important site and a transformative site the classroom is, it actually just linked me back to something you said at the beginning, Rod, just about the way in which the bans and the attacks that we see happening right now are actually also an expression of some of the progress and success that we have had. And it's really fascinating to me because right now I'm working on a project that looks at all of the laws, policies, legal codes, practices that were put into place to monitor and surveil Black people, free and enslaved Black people, stemming all the way back to the colonial period. And what has become really powerful and fascinating to me about looking at the language of the laws is that as much as it tells us about the power and the long arm of the state, it also tells us about the weakness, the fragility, and the anxiety of the state, right? It actually, to me, tells us a lot more about the weakness of their power than it does about the strength of their power. And I feel like once you start seeing people go out of their ways to pass laws, to ban things, it lets you know that they are aware that what's happening on the ground is working.
Yes, that's right. I mean,
right?
Absolutely. I mean, what you're saying is that what we often take as the evidence of confidence and strength is actually the evidence of desperation.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, exactly. That, right? This is why I'm saying, like, we have to look at this as a mass desperation on the part of the right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I really like
responding to, real advances that have taken place, I mean, this is what's been so enlightening about this book, when I can read my title clear. I don't think I actually knew that the prohibitions, legal and de facto, against literacy was because there was so much literacy among free and enslaved folks. I don't think I really knew that.
Yes. And that people were using literacy to fight and leverage their freedom.
Yeah. But it wasn't just individuals, it was like people forming schools and assemblies. And it was a big
Yes.
I have one more question I'd like to pose to you that is from the audience. That is a really nice synthesis of some of the things that we've been talking about. First of all, she says, thank you. This has been a brilliant discussion. And she says, recognizing that the scope of the panel is on banning books and banning knowledge, I'd like to hear the panelists' perspective on the particularly embodied nature of forms of surveillance that are also distilling at this time around trans bodies. How do we understand how these forms of surveillance work together, of knowledge and its production, alongside the more embodied ways in which this oppression takes place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Now, this is what I've been trying to get at in a couple of pieces that I've written, like that Chronicle of Higher Ed piece, but also, I have a short piece for the book that Colin Kaepernick and Keeanga Yamada Taylor and Robin Kelly are doing. Is exactly tries to get at this question, right? That right now we're in a moment where, you think about the university and knowledge production before, the great social movements of like the 60s, the changes in the university because of those movements, the gender movement, the anti-racist movements, on and on and on, right? Knowledge was supposed to be this disembodied thing. It was abstract. It was abstracted in white men, but they were supposed to be universal, right? What you have now is a moment since then in which there is a basic presumption almost that knowledge is embodied, right? That it is not abstracted, that certain communities produce particular histories, and out of those particular histories come particular cultural productions that are related to how they are embodied. And in many ways, the attacks that we're seeing understand this as well, right? We will go after the intellectual production, and we will go after the producers and the recipients of that production, right? So, it's a kind of two-pronged thing. We will go after the epistemic issue, but we will also go after the embodiment of those issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you're right, Maggie, that this actually does, in a weird way, I think, take us back to the beginning, the very beginning of the conversation, right? Which is that I do think this is an act. Everything that we're seeing, I think, is an act of desperation on the part of the far right. And it means that they need to try to grasp and gain and retain as much power as they can. And so we're seeing it manifesting in a variety of ways: attacks on individual communities, right? Like the trans community, but also the immigrant community.
Muslim.
I mean, look what is about to happen at the border in a matter of just days now. And so, right. So I think it's literally going to be attacks on people and on communities of people, but it's also going to be attacks on ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think it is important that we actually see the interconnection between those, right? That attacks on people are attacks on ideas, and attacks on ideas are also attacks on people, right? That those things are deeply intertwined. So I think it's not at all surprising, right, that we are seeing legislation and surveillance and policing, right, happening of particular communities at the same time that we're also seeing these bans that also attack the same communities unfolding at the same time.
Yeah, and this is also, it's worth saying that this link between intellection and embodiment is something brought to us by feminism. Okay,
That's right.
Particularly women of color feminism.
Mm-hmm.
You think about the Audre Lordes, the Angela Davises, or in terms of the novelists, right? Toni Morrison, Gloria Anzaldúa, that intellection is embodied, all right? So here we see both, the sort of racism of the right and also the misogyny of the right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how to express the emotions I'm feeling right now after this hour and 15 minutes, but I oddly feel buoyed by it because you both have really helped clarify things, but you also really reminded us about our responses, our own agency, our own resistance, and the newer and better ways that we're doing that, especially led by young people. And so we appreciate you not leaving us despondent at the end of this conversation. Thank you both for a really, really wonderful talk. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.